Hey. Okay. Everyone, good to smile. Good. Okay. Lesson 3. Please open your books. And next week is going to be Thanksgiving, and the following week is going to be Hanukkah. And we could only deal with anti-Semitism by outsmarting it. So just to tell you an interesting anecdote. So many years ago, we had camp. We were starting camp, and we built a pool. I'm not going to say which township this happened in. And for some reason, the inspector was like giving us a real hard time. It was an above-ground pool. There was really nothing to inspect. So at that time, we had a fellow by the name of Yoni Cohen. He was he was helping us with camp. He oversaw the construction of this above-ground pool. I said, Yoni, this inspector, I don't know what he has with us. You deal with him. I'm not staying here. Anyway, so Yoni goes and he watches the guy. The guy, all he had to inspect was an outlet. Like an outlet, that's it, because it's an above-ground pool. There's nothing to inspect other than the outlet which the filter goes into. And Yoni sees the guy like looking and schlepping, whatever. So Yoni goes over to the guy and he says, can you do me a favor? He says, I need you to fail me. Why do you want me to fail you? He says, the electrician overcharged me. And I really want to go back to him and tell him that he didn't do a good job. This is after the guy is looking and looking. He says, no, the guy did a great job. He put a green sticker on the left. So if he would have started arguing, what are you looking? There's nothing to look. It's all good. No, fine. No, please fail me. Oh, I'll get that Jew. He wants to try to chisel out someone. Anyway, we have to know how to outsmart anti-Semites. Anyway, now we're going to learn about the Promised Land. The Promised Land. Today, hatred, we're on page 83. Today, hatred of Jews commonly manifests itself as antagonism towards the Jewish state. This class distinguishes all-out anti-Semitism from some more nuanced substrains. It also examines the state of Israel education that goes on in America and throughout the world, and the very nature of the Jewish nationhood. Okay. So today we're going to discuss the following questions. How do we counter Israel-focused anti-Semitism? Why are so many Jews joining the anti-Israel movements? And what can be done to stop this? And number 3, why is Israel important to us? So unfortunately, I have to talk about the obvious. Okay. So welcome to the 3rd class of Outsmarting Anti-Semitism. Today we're going to talk about the challenges of anti-Semitism in today's day and age, which usually surrounds itself around the Jews because of their association with the land of Israel. So we're going to start with the video, give us a little bit of a history of the anti-Semitism that goes on in today's day and age as it pertains to the land of Israel. Just give me a second. Hopefully it's going to work. JLI. Tell me if it's...
On the eastern shore of Manhattan Island, the United Nations headquarters.
You guys hear and see it? On Zoom, can you give me a thumbs up? You don't? You do. Okay, thank you.
Headquarters rises from a row of colored flags that represent a multitude of nations. Across the avenue, the Isaiah Wall proclaims a Jewish prophet's vision of universal peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares. and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The UN's mission is precisely that, to resolve armed conflicts and to foster global harmony. But inside the august chambers of the United Nations, founded in 1945 as a response to a war-ravaged world desperate for coexistence, Isaiah could have easily found himself the target of virulent condemnation had he survived into modern times. Isaiah lived in ancient Israel that for over a millennia included the territories that the UN considers illegally occupied by today's Jewish state. The Temple Mount that lies at the heart of Isaiah's prophecy is no longer considered by the UN to be the heritage or possession of the Jewish people. Indeed, the tiny country that Isaiah called home has become the focus of the majority of the UN's denunciations and has inspired more censure than all of today's tyrants put together. Iran, North Korea, and other brutal regimes systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, has murdered 10.
1 second. Yeah, I gotta mute. I need everyone to please mute themselves. Okay, I gotta mute everyone. Hello,
She muted herself. I
huh?
didn't know where the noise was coming from, so they muted themselves.
How do we mute over here so we don't have this issue?
Wow.
How do we
But
just-
they muted themselves.
Okay,
You could go over the thing, usually mute them.
we're
Yeah,
here.
right in the top right.
Want to mute everyone?
So you have to, I don't know, could you have to, after sharing maybe?
Okay, fine.
Or just ask them to mute themselves.
Please,
Targeted Israel. That has inspired more censure than all of today's tyrants put together. Iran, North Korea, and other brutal regimes systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, has murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians. Apparently, however, that isn't very important in the eyes of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, who continually pass one-sided resolutions that single out and condemn Israel. An overwhelmingly powerful bloc led by the Arab nations promotes a narrow and slanderous agenda meant to isolate Israel. This agenda has met little resistance. The UN's General Assembly votes on 70 to 100 resolutions annually. 15 to 20 of these regularly express disapproval of Israel. From 2016 until 2020, the Assembly adopted 122 resolutions criticizing various countries. 91 of these targeted Israel. That's 75% of all country-specific resolutions. And while 3/4 of this global forum's written rage lambastes the Jewish state, precious few of the most repressive or blood-soaked regimes on earth have received even a single rebuke. Emergency special sessions of the Assembly are rare. During the last 40 years, they've been convened for one purpose only: to condemn Israel. The Assembly's embrace of a terrorist entity has been equally astounding. In October 1974, 14 years before the Palestinian Liberation Organization even nominally forswore terrorism, the Assembly voted to invite a PLO spokesman to take part in its deliberations. This was the first time that anyone who was neither a government representative nor a head of a quasi-state was granted such a privilege. The following year, the Assembly awarded the PLO permanent representative status. A few months later, the UN infamously approved Resolution 3379, branding Zionism as a form of racism. At the time, Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, told his fellow delegates that Hitler would have felt at home listening to the UN debate on the measure.
For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such.
Since the 1993 Oslo Accords, hundreds of Israelis have been killed and thousands injured by Palestinian terror attacks. During the same period, the UN passed dozens of resolutions deploring Israel, but not one against the terror attacks. Since the 2006 creation of the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's human rights abusers have suffered nary a mild rebuke. Israel, on the other hand, is chastised as often as all of the rest of the countries combined, and in terms more condemnatory. At the Council's every meeting, a topic billed as, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories is raised as a separate agenda item, while the remaining totality of mankind constitutes a single other point on the agenda. From 2006 to May 2021, Israel was condemned in no less than 94 Human Rights Council resolutions. During the same period, Syria was condemned 36 times, North Korea 14 times, and China has been spared condemnation altogether. Even within the walls of the UN, the absurdity of its anti-Israel bias is fleetingly, partially acknowledged. In September 2006, UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan conceded.
Supporters of Israel feel that it is harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often this is true, particularly in some UN bodies.
In August 2013, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon reflected on Israel's treatment at the UN.
There is some bias against Israeli people and government.
In December 2016, he told the UN Security Council,
A disproportionate volume of resolutions, reports, and conferences criticizing Israel.
One of the more telling comments came inadvertently in November 2013, when a UN interpreter failed to silence her microphone as she addressed her colleague.
I mean, I think when you have 5 statements, not 5, like a total of 10 resolutions on Israel and Palestine, there's got to be something. C'est un peu trop, no? I mean, I know it's yes, it's right, but it's not there's other really bad happening. Nobody says anything about the other stuff. Apologies.
Okay, I understand there was a problem with interpretation.
Israel is not larger than 8,019 square miles in total. It is the Middle East's only functioning democracy and champion of human rights. It is a world provider of humanitarian disaster relief and medical, agricultural, ecological, scientific, technological, and security innovations. But when seen through the lens of historical UN bias, the overwhelming majority of all the world's evils and all of the world's ills belong to the tiny Jewish homeland in which Isaiah spoke his vision of swords being beaten into plowshares.
Okay, that's a good introduction to what we're dealing with today. Hold on. Okay. So we're going to focus today on what is the reason that the anti-Semitism of today is focused on Israel. What exactly is it? Why? Why is it? So we're going to start with a reading from Jonathan Sachs. It's a reading that I have mentioned in previous classes, and he talks about anti-Semitism as a virus. We're on page 84, text number 1. Anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. If you remember last week, we spoke about not just the history of anti-Semitism, not just the absurdity and how it's contradictory. Right. It is, in fact, an endless stream of contradictions. The best way of understanding it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense, the human immune system. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in doing so, defeats the immune system set up
Rabbi, you froze. Rabbi, we can't hear you. I think you're frozen.
We can't hear you, Rabbi Casano.
I think we just lost him.
We lost you a few minutes ago, Rabbi Cosno. We lost you a while ago, Rabbi Cosno. Is anybody hearing anything?
I think he's back.
Okay, now they can hear you.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome back.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
We lost you when you said anti-Semitism mutates and in doing so defeats the immune system.
Oh, okay. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates and in doing so defeats the immune system set up by the cultures to protect themselves against hatred. Most people at most times feel a residual guilt at hating the innocent. So what do you got to do? You got to make sure the Jews are not innocent, right? Therefore, anti-Semitism has always had to find legitimation in the most prestigious source of authority at any given time. So now he goes through history. In the first centuries of the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages, this was religion. This is why Judophobia took the form of religious doctrine. So people were very religious, so therefore Jews were hated because they were antichrist. In the 19th century, religion has lost prestige and the supreme authority was now science. Racial anti-Semitism was duly based on two pseudo-sciences: social Darwinism, the idea that in society as in nature, the strong survive by elimination of the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race, right? So that's what Hitler used race, used science to put the Jewish people at the lowest. By the late 20th century, science has lost its prestige, having given us the power to destroy life on earth. Today, the supreme source of legitimacy is human rights. That is why Jews, or the Jewish state, are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity. In other words, whatever society feels is a bad thing, come the anti-Semites and say, hey, that's the Jews. That's all. If you're against Christianity, it's not good. Oh, the Jews are against Christianity, right? So they always find that which people find legitimate to show that the Jews are not that way, so we're illegitimate. Okay. See, if you look at figure number 3, 1.1 on page 86, he goes through the stages of obviously it's much more than this, but just talking generally. The point is, what anti-Semites do is they take that which people worship and talk about and say the Jews are not that. They always use the hot button topic and say the Jews are not that. And then it's absurd, like you have in the video. Understand? Syria, North Korea, Iran, they're sitting on the council to tell us that we are violating human rights. You understand? That's how they find legitimacy. So that's basically after the Holocaust, human rights became the buzzword, and therefore, especially in so-called progressive liberal circles, that became the God, that became the new religion, and now Jews are guilty of that. The issue is, however, we're not saying that everything Israel does is 100% correct, right? So how do we differentiate between criticizing a behavior of a country as opposed to making it illegitimate? So how do we navigate that? How do we differentiate between legitimate criticism of Israel and criticism motivated by anti-Semitism? Listen, don't we criticize Israel? In Israel itself, they criticize themselves. So are we trying to say here that if you ever criticize Israel, you're anti-Semite, you're an anti-Semite? Any non-Jew that criticizes Israel is an anti-Semite, you can't say that. There's maybe some legitimate criticism. So how do we differentiate between legitimate criticism or illegitimate criticism, right? I can criticize my own family or people in my family for what they're doing. Does that mean I say it's all legitimate? I don't. So how do we differentiate? So actually, in this course, they bring actually a reading that I didn't know about it myself, just to give you a little bit of a background. After the Romans conquered Israel and destroyed the temple and exiled the Jews, Jews faced harsh rules and laws by the Romans. One of the most infamous Roman emperors was Hadrian. In the time, he was the one that was responsible for killing the 10 martyrs that we talk about in Yom Kippur. In the Talmud, he's called Adonionis. We call him Hadrian. So the Medrash tells a story about a Jew who wrote a letter to Hadrian. It's a very funny name. I've never heard this name. But that's what the Medrash tells the story, which basically gives us a good understanding of how you can differentiate between legitimate criticism and anti-Semitism. Imi Kantron, the name of some person, he wrote to the emperor. This is what the Medrash says. He wrote to the Emperor Hadrian. If it is okay, so let me backdrop. We'll give a background to this. One of the two things, among others, that Hadrian prohibited, besides we know the study of Torah, he prohibited circumcisions. He prohibited resting on Shabbos. Right? That was like the old complaint about the Jews, that they are lazy, right? Now, the funny thing is, Hadrian comes approximately 200 years after the story of Hanukkah. We're having the story of Hanukkah the week after next, right? Well, what did Antiochus do? King Antiochus also prohibited bris and also prohibited Shabbos. So this fellow, Imi Kantron, wrote a letter to the Emperor Hadrian, asking him and questioning his new edicts prohibiting Shabbos, the observance of Shabbos, and circumcision. Imi Kantron wrote to the Emperor Hadrian, if it is circumcision that you hate, Arabian tribes also circumcised. Now the Roman, this is, by the way, this is way before Muhammad. right? This is during the early Roman reign in Israel. So, but still, the descendants of Ishmael, right? The Arabs, even before Islam, they would circumcise, 13 years old and so on. So he wrote to him, if you hate circumcision, Arab tribes also circumcise. So why is the rule of circumcision only applied to Jews? If it's Shabbos observance that you despise, the Kuthians similarly observe Shabbos. Now, who are the Kuthians? The Kuthians are people who lived in northern Israel. If you ever heard of the Samaritans, Shomronim, Samaritans. So where did they get the names of Samaritans? Basically, before the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, we know that the 10 Israel, there was a civil war in Israel, right? So we're all called Jews. We come because we all come from the king of Judea, right? Which is basically 3 tribes, right? It's basically Yehuda, Benjamin, and the Levites. Maybe a little bit of Shimon. All Jews these days come basically from 3 tribes. 10 tribes, which are the 10 northern tribes, they were all conquered by the king of Israel, right? Because Israel was split into 2, Judea and Israel, and by the king Sancherib, who was the king of Assyria, and he exiled the Jews. And what did he do? He moved the Jews out to other countries and put people of other countries into Israel. Wherever he conquered, he took the people. He didn't want them to feel ownership. Whichever country the Assyrians conquered, they took the people of that country, put them somewhere else. So the Samaritans, that are called Kutzim, Kuthians, are non-Jews that were placed in Israel. Now, by living in it, going back to 130 years before the destruction of the first temple, right? So you're now talking about around 600-700 years before Hadrian. So they adopted a lot of the Jewish customs. They weren't non-Jews. So they didn't work on Shabbos either. But the rules that Hadrian imposed on about Shabbos were only on the Jews, not on the northern communities, the Kuthians. So he wrote to him, if it is, yeah, they're still there, right? Not a lot to it. He says, if it is Shabbos observant that you despise, the Kuthians similarly observe Shabbos. So do you hate circumcision? Do you hate Shabbos? If you hate circumcision and you hate Shabbos, then if that's the agenda, why aren't you imposing these rules on other people? Clearly, then, you simply hate the Jewish people. Their God will exact punishment of you. The Medrash says that Hadrian tried to find out who this guy was, couldn't find him, whatever. But what do we see? This is a very interesting. So how do you differentiate between criticism and anti-Semitism is if there is a double standard. Let's say Hadrian has this crazy thing. He thinks people should be working 6 days a week, 7 days a week. Okay, that's his craziness. And therefore he can't stand that the Jews are resting. If that's his craze, then why doesn't it apply to other people? That means that this is not the craze. He hates the Jews, and he's using this as an excuse. The same thing as bris. That's what this fellow wrote. Now, it happens to be that in more modern days, this idea of double standards is what even modern fighters of anti-Semitism bring up, that the way to understand the legitimate criticism, how do you define the legitimate criticism? Are these people that are criticizing, do they criticize other countries who are doing the same or much, much, much worse? If they're not, that means that this is not what bothers them. In the next reading, it's taken from Nathan Sharansky, everyone knows that he was a refusenik. Unfortunately, fortunately he got out at the end, but he had a very tough life. You know that he was arrested like a few days right after his wedding. He got married to Avital, and she went off to Israel. He thought he's going to get permission and a visa to leave, permission to leave. They didn't give him permission to leave, and then he started to make a ruckus. So they went and they arrested him and they sent him into the Gulag for 13 years. Eventually he got out. But he talks about this idea of how do you differentiate between legitimate criticism and anti-Semitism. And he says like this, text number 3, page 89. I believe that we can apply a simple test. I call it the 3D test to help us distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. What are the 3 Ds? The first D is the test of demonization. When the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis and between Palestinian refugee camps in Auschwitz, we're Nazis and we're putting the Palestinians in Auschwitz, right? This is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. If you don't think we're treating someone nice, okay, we can talk about it. Who's at fault? But to compare Jews to Nazis and Palestinian refugees camp to Auschwitz, that what's it called? That demonization itself is anti-Semitism. The second D is the test of double standards, at which we talked in the Medrash. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses, while the behavior of known and major abusers, such as China, Iran, Cuba, and Syria, is ignored. When Israel's Magen David Adom, right, that's the ambulance system in Israel, alone among the world's ambulance services is denied admission to the International Red Cross, this is anti-Semitism. So the second D is double standards. The third D is the test of delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental rights to exist is denied, it's one thing you criticize something I'm doing. You say I have no right to exist. Alone among all peoples in the world, this too is anti-Semitism. This is what Natan Sharansky calls the 3 Ds. So it's a very, very simple way of knowing if someone legitimately has a concern or legitimate criticism, or it's coming from anti-Semitism. If there's a double standard, it's anti-Semitism. If you're delegitimizing the existence of something or someone, right? So Hitler said Jews have no right to exist. His excuse was they do this, they do that, and so on. But as a result, they have no right to exist. Israel has no right to exist. It's anti-Semitism, right? And when you demonize, that's anti-Semitism. So that's a very clear way of seeing the difference between criticism and anti-Semitism. But here's where things get very, very murky. It becomes murky when Jews join the anti-Semites. Why does it become murky? Because then the anti-Semite says, I'm an anti-Semite? What are you talking about? Look at all these Jews that agree with me. They're my friends. What are you talking about? What causes Jews to join anti-Semitism? To understand it, we have to discuss the difference between Haman's anti-Semitism, the Purim anti-Semitism, and Antiochus anti-Semitism, the Chanukah anti-Semitism. No Jews joined Haman, but many Jews joined Antiochus. We call them the Hellenists. What was the difference? They were both anti-Semites. Yeah, but why? The answer is the difference between Haman's anti-Semitism and King Antiochus' anti-Semitism is the Greeks didn't come like Haman and say they wanted to destroy Jews. They didn't do that. They said Jews have outdated, antiquated, and repulsive laws that need to change. They focused Shabbos. They focused on circumcision and other things. They didn't try to get rid of Jews. They tried to get rid of certain rituals that Jews engage in. What do Jews do, unfortunately? They say, you know what? They're right. Why are we stuck with these antiquated, outdated laws that make no sense? They are right. We should become like them. They're not looking to kill us. They're not even looking to change the whole Torah. There's just certain aspects in the Torah that are antiquated and are cruel. Circumcision is cruel, and that we should get rid of. So what happens is Jews join Antiochus and they become the worst enemies of their fellow brothers. And they believe that they're doing right because we're actually saving Judaism. We're saving the real Judaism by getting rid of the antiquated parts of Judaism. That's the difference between Antiochus's anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, and Haman's hatred of Jews. No Jews joined Haman hatred of Jews because Haman just said, "You guys are different. I want to kill you." That's it. Antiochus didn't say, "I want to kill you." Antiochus says, "I just got to get rid of you have certain behaviors that we can't tolerate. They're not humane, your behaviors." So what happens? Unfortunately, uneducated Jews that don't look at Jewish history or don't look at the Jewish future, they join these anti-Semites, and they become, in a sense, worse than the Goyim themselves. The same thing happened in the former Soviet Union. Former Soviet Union, same thing happened. Many Jews became communists. They were worse than the Goyim. They would find all the hidden mikvahs, they would find all the hidden shuls, all the underground yeshivas, and they would report them, and they'd be very proud of it. Because we got to get rid of the antiquated stuff. We are Jews, we are proud communists. On a side note, Stalin in 1938 killed them all out. Killed them because he didn't trust anyone anyway. He killed them, they all died. But from 1920 to 1938, right, they were very strong. There was actually a Jewish section of the Communist Party called the Yevsektia, right? Yevsektia, the Jewish section of the Communist Party. They were worse than the Goyim, in a sense. And that's the problem. That means it's one thing to have a Goy that hates you, but then the Goy can then say, the non-Jew can say, "Hey, I don't hate Jews. Look, all these Jews agree with me." That's the problem Israel is facing now. Not just from Jew haters that will delegitimize and have a double standard, but they have Jews that are with them. Okay, which brings us to text number 4 on page 91. Hanukkah anti-Semitism doesn't demand dead or expel Jews. Shh. Guys. Hanukkah anti-Semitism doesn't demand dead or expel Jews, at least not at first. Instead, it demands the destruction of Jewish civilization. This process requires not dead Jews, but Jews who are willing to give up whatever specific aspects of Jewish civilization is deemed to be uncool. Not cool, it's outdated. Of course, Judaism has always been uncool, which is why cool people find it so threatening, and why Jews who are willing to become cool are absolutely necessary to Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism success. In the days of Antiochus, this type of anti-Semitism needed these boys who voluntarily underwent painful genital surgery to prove that Jews weren't the problem, just the barbarity of Jewish laws. Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism always promises Jews a kind of nobility, offering them the opportunity to cleanse themselves of whatever the people around them happen to find revolting. The Jewish traits designated as repulsive vary by country and time period, but they invariably contradict the specific values that the surrounding culture has embraced as universal. Everyone agrees that this is disgusting. Why are you Jews just sticking to it? Thanks to Judaism's inherent uncoolness, there will never be a shortage of Jews willing to comply. So what's going on now on college campuses? Israel are colonialists. Who created the state of Israel? The Balfour Declaration, right? After the First World War, the forerunner of the United Nations was the League of Nations, and they gave the Middle East section of planet Earth to France and Britain, and Britain was charged with the mission of carving out a state for the Jewish people. And the Balfour Declaration declared that this section of the Middle East will become a Jewish state. And then later in 1947, the UN voted, right? The UN voted to partition Israel. This all started with the English. You know who the English were? People that just conquered and just took control of other people's lands, whatever. And we have done the same. We have created a state, a land that was inhabited by Arabs, by Palestinians. So we're no different than the forerunners of the whole Balfour Declaration. So we became the terrible colonialists. In a sense, all of America is that way because we chased out the Indians. So it's the whole West is all corrupt. You have to understand. And Jews, unfortunately, young Jews are educated in our universities and our colleges with this type of outlook. So they say for sure we have to criticize Israel. So no, go to the extent not that there should be two states. There should be one state. There shouldn't be any Israel at all. So this is unfortunately the situation we're in now. We're not facing Haman anti-Semitism. We're facing Hanukkah anti-Semitism, where the anti-Semites are not saying what Hitler said, all Jews have to die. No. Jews are doing things that are illegitimate, and we have to stop it, that's all. What is the problem with this whole thing? How do Jewish kids get involved in these movements? How do they get brainwashed in our colleges? Simple answer is there's a lack of proper Jewish education. There's a lack of proper Jewish education. And let me tell you, we're all suffering from it. The mere fact that Jews think that Israel is a state created in 1947 is problem number one. Because the same UN that created Israel, the same UN can delegitimize Israel. I created you, I can take you apart. And Jews are celebrating, and actually believe that the League of Nations, the United Nations, created the state of Israel. That's the first mistake and problem. But before we get to that, let's talk about what do most people feel as the Jewish rights to Israel. Can you list on page 93 3 commonly cited reasons in the order of frequency with which you believe or you hear that we have a legitimate right to live and govern the state of Israel? What are the most 3 common reasons given? So David, if someone says to you, do you believe that Israel has a right to govern this part of the world and to have a state there? Yeah, someone asks you.
Yes, of course.
Tell me why.
Because they've been there for 3,000 years.
Okay, they've been 3,000 years. Any other reason? Well, they've been there for 3,000 years. Okay.
It's still our capital.
Okay, any other reason?
Didn't God give it to us?
God gave it to us, okay. I haven't heard that too often.
God gave it to Israel? Is that
No, that's what.
It's not the argument in the
It's not the argument in the world. What other? There are those that claim international law. International law. The League of Nations. What? The most common answers that are given is one, what David just said. Number 2, international law gave us the land, like I mentioned before, the Balfour Declaration. And number 3, listen, we're being kicked out from every country, we've been persecuted. We need a land of our own. But the problem with that, a problem with these three approaches is the following. If you take the Jewish survival approach, well, why Israel? Take another land. Go to Uganda. If the whole reason you need a country is because almost
You're frozen again.
Froze. You froze, Rabbi Chazano.
I texted Levi.
What was the third reason? He listed 3 reasons, which is no.
The Holocaust.
Yeah.
I guess we needed a safe haven for that because of the Holocaust.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, it's Rabbi Levi. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I.
That's not a good sign.
Do we know anybody who's in the class in the room? I'll try the rabbi. My dad, he'll pick up his phone.
We text Tova. Would Tova come and interrupt?
Can try.
Let's see. I think I have her cell.
Yeah, okay. 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 Okay, thanks. All right, they're trying to reconnect us.
Great.
Have you been, Carol?
How about yourself?
Okay, thanks.
Good.
do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
The anti-Semites are working overtime. I don't know what's going on here. Okay. So the problem with the third argument that we have history there, we've been there for so long, they can claim they've been there for longer. They can claim. As I mentioned before, some of them claim they're there from the original Canaanites. So once we start arguing with these individual, even though the historical is the I would say the strongest, Jewish survival is not a very strong argument for the land of Israel. Okay, so let's talk about the counter argument that those that oppose Israel come up with to these 3 most common answers we have. Turned off by colonialism. Okay, this is written by a Jew, right? And he writes that he fights anti-Semitism, but supports Palestinian rights. Okay, when I was a Jewish kid, growing up in suburban Los Angeles, we thought being Jewish meant supporting Israel. There really wasn't a choice. If you identified as Jewish, as I and most of my friends did, the religious education we got, the youth groups we joined, and the summer camps where we played, were all grounded in one thing. It wasn't God, it was Zionism, the political project of settling Jewish people in Israel. My own break with Zionism came in my mid-20s after reading the letters of Zionism's founder, Theodor Herzl, imploring Cecil Rhodes, the leader of British land theft in Africa, to support his work in Palestine. Their projects were both something colonial, Herzl assured Rhodes. So therefore, the founders of the State of Israel, Theodor Herzl, really supported colonialism. So, and that on that base, Israel was founded. So I definitely can't support that. So speaks a Jewish child, an educated Jewish child, who claims to fight anti-Semitism, but does not see the reason that Israel has any legitimate reason to exist. Okay, so how do we approach this? Now, the truth is, I remember growing up and visiting different youth groups when I was a yeshiva boy, and whether I was in Australia, Europe, or even in America, many of the youth groups, the Zionist youth groups, they really were teaching the children. And most Jews actually grew up with this notion that Herzl is the founder of the modern state of Israel. And when you go on that path, we have this situation where you say, well, if Herzl was in cahoots with the English or colonialists, so the whole Israel is based on, or the whole Israel is based on the UN, international law, the international law says, it says that what we're doing is wrong. Instead of, to me, the answer to the problem is, he writes over here, the summer camps where we played were all grounded in one thing. It wasn't God, it was Zionism. We based our whole history of the Jewish people and the whole legitimacy of Israel on Zionism, or on the founders of Zionism. And that's where the problem is. We're going to see some of the readings of the Rebbe, how he looked at it, and so on. So here's an interesting example. There was a man who was a traveling businessman, and he came back to New York, and he wrote a letter to the Rebbe. It was very, very dissatisfied. Why was he dissatisfied? He went to a shul, and there was a man, they had just a minyan. There was a man that opened up a newspaper and was reading a newspaper the whole daven. Reading a newspaper. He wrote to the Rebbe, this is terrible. The Rebbe wrote to him, it's not terrible at all. Not terrible at all. Unfortunately, this person did not get enough of a proper Jewish education to know what davening is about. But the mere fact that he's coming to shul to help make a minyan, that means that his Jewish pulse is pulsating. So why are you focusing on the fact that he opened the newspaper and the whole davening he was reading a newspaper? Maybe you should focus on the fact that he was in shul and he cares about even making the minyan. True, his education was not up to par because if he was educated with the understanding about the importance of davening, he wouldn't open up a paper. But why are you focusing on that? We should focus on the lack of Jewish education. Don't get upset about that person. Get upset about the society or the institutions that brought about a product of a Jew who's proud to be Jewish, is identifying as a Jew, is in shul, but at the same time opening the paper. The same thing is about many of the ailments that we are facing. We have to look at the education system. And if we look at the education system, we'll find that if we approached it the old-fashioned way, people would get it. People would get it. So interestingly enough, where is the connection between Israel and Judaism discussed in the Torah? Where is it discussed in the Torah? Does it start when God promised Abraham? The answer is no. You know where it's discussed? In the first verse of the Torah. In the first verse of the Torah, where the Torah says, in the beginning of creation, God created heaven and earth. That's where the connection between the Jewish people and Israel is discussed. How is that? So there's the most famous Rashi, the most famous commentary on the first verse of the Torah. Rashi asks a monumental question. Why is the Torah starting with creation? The Torah is not a history book. The Torah is what? A book of mitzvahs. The Torah is a book of telling us how we should behave, how we should fulfill our mission. Why do we have to know what was created the first day, the second day, the third day? Why do we have to even talk about creation? Just talk about the mitzvahs. Why is the Torah even talking about creation? Rashi asks this question. And he quotes a medrash. Here inside. Omar Rabbi Yitzchak stated, page 95. This is on the first verse of the Torah. Rabbi Yitzchak stated, the Torah should have begun with the first mitzvah commanded to the Jewish people. Where's the first mitzvah commanded? Before we're about to leave Egypt. Which is contained in the verse, this month shall be to you a month that's the first of all months. For what purpose does the Torah start with the verse in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth? Says Rabbi Yitzchak follows. The solution is found in the following verse. He recounted the strength of his work, that the reason why Hashem is telling us about his creation of the world to his people, to give them the inheritance of nations. You know who says that? King David in Psalms, right? King David in Psalms says that Hashem told us about creation in order to give us the inheritance of the nations. Why? What does that mean? How do we understand King David? Says the Medrash, in other words, if the nations of the world would accuse the Jewish people with the claim, you're thieves for having conquered the lands from the seven nations, the Jews should reply, the entire world is God's. He created it and granted it to whoever he desired. It was his will to initially give it to the seven nations, and it's his will to subsequently remove it from them and give it to us. So when does the Torah make a point of talking to us about the connection between the Jewish people and Israel? Not when God told Abraham the land will give it to you. We have to first know that there is a creator to this universe. And he connected certain people with certain parcels of land. So who gave the right of Hashem to say to Abraham, this land will be given to your descendants? Who gave him the right? He's the creator. He created the land to begin with. That's how the Medrash interprets the whole beginning of the Torah as creation. Which brings us to text number 7, what David just said. God told Abraham on page 97, raise your eyes and look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west, all the land that you see, I'll give to you and your offspring forever. So this was a promise that Hashem gave Abraham, that your children will end up foreign to them. They will be enslaved, right? They'll be enslaved for 400, they'll be wanderers and slaves for close to 400 years. They'll come out of that land with great wealth, and they will be brought back to this, the 4th generation of those that entered Egypt will come back to this land, and this will be their eternal home. Who gives Hashem the right to do it? He's the creator. Here is an argument the Rebbe uses. This is the argument the Rebbe uses when he talks about the state of Israel. Because the Rebbe always talked about the state of Israel, never talked about it from international law, from the Jews are being persecuted, need a place to live, or historical. The Rebbe said clearly, it's our land because the Torah says it's our land, because the Creator said it's our land. That's the connection. Here's what the Rebbe says. I've received complaints. Why do I invoke the biblical land of Israel, the Holy Land, and the covenant with Abraham in connection with the modern Israel? Why do I mix God into the picture? After all, they say, those who fought for the creation of the state, those who led it, those who country directed, and its authorized representatives, they all proclaim and take pains to emphasize that Israel is a state founded in 1948. My answer, put frankly, is that their narrative is false. No new entity was created in 1948. Rather, that was the year in which a large part of the land of Israel was liberated. Israel was not created in 1948. It was liberated in 1948. An entity established in 1948 based on the agreement or authorization of the nations of the world has no strength or justification in terms of an authentic response to the claim, you are thieves for having conquered lands belonging to others, etc. A claim raised by the Arabs, the Vatican, the United Nations, and some Jews as well. This is why it is so crucial to underscore that it is our God-given homeland. And someone was writing to the Rebbe criticizing that he always talks about the Holy Land given to us by the God, the creator of this world, and promised Abraham. Why are you mixing God into this? Because that's the truth. That's our claim to the land. Not that the UN gave it us in 1948. Now, I do not delude myself, this is the Rebbe writing, into imagining that these just and honest arguments will prevail in the United Nations, the Vatican, etc. Nevertheless, transmitting this truth is critical for the morale of Jewish youth living in the Holy Land, including those serving in the IDF, for Jewish American students, and for the Jewish youth of other countries as well. You understand what the Rebbe is saying is? I'm not trying to influence the United Nations. I need that Jewish kids that are serving in the IDF, Jewish kids that are in America and other countries, they should know the truth. Because if they don't know the truth, guess what's going to happen? They will become that modern day Hellenists. That's what the Rebbe is saying. We're not educating our kids with the ultimate truth. A child has to grow up knowing that there's a God to the world, there's a creator. He's the boss. He decided which part of this planet goes to who he decided should go to. That is not true. Because of that promise, we've been there. What David said is true. Because of that promise, we've been there. Jews have been in Israel. There was always a Jewish presence in Israel, small or big. But not because we've been there, because this is the land that the Creator gave us. That's what Jews have to know that. If Jews don't know it, and Jews are convinced that this land is 70 years old, it's a new state, it's not true. In 1948, a new state was not created. In 1948, our state was liberated. That's what happened. That's how Jewish kids have to grow up. Now, there's a deeper understanding of this. To understand this medrash, the Rebbe goes into this a little bit more. Why would the nations of the world say to the Jewish people, you're thieves, you conquered this land from the 7 nations? That's what happens throughout the whole society. How did America get here? How did any country conquered other countries? So why would they come to the Jews and say, you conquered this land, you're thieves? What do you mean? How did the 7 nations conquer it? How did every other nation, they were all there from the beginning of creation? What happened over here? The Rebbe says that the complaint to the Jews are much deeper. The complaint to the Jews is that you don't even need a land. You're not a people of a land, and that complaint is true. What makes a Jew is not because we have the land of Israel. What makes a Jew is the Torah received. We are people of the book. So therefore the nations of the world say, you're the people of the book, you don't need a land. Our answer is, as we're going to learn, yes, Hashem wanted us to have a land, and he gave us a specific land. Sure, we're the people of the book. Sure, we don't need a land to exist as a nation. The land doesn't create the nation, but the nation was given a specific land. We're going to learn it inside. Nationhood, text number 9. The Jewish nation is, this is from Rabbi Sadia Gaon, the Jewish nation is only a nation through its Torah. And the secret of our immortality is not that we have a land. The secret of immortality is something that's beyond land. But that doesn't take away the connection and the importance of the land of Israel. Follow inside, text number 10. An objective, unprejudiced survey of long history of our people will at once bring to light the reality that our survival as a nation was not the result of material wealth or physical strength. Even during the most prosperous times under the united monarchy of King Solomon, the Jewish people, as well as its country, were materially insignificant by comparison with contemporary world empires such as Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia. Nor was it our active statehood or the control of our geographic homeland that secured our existence, as is evidence from the reality that for the vast majority of our history, our people have lived in exile, without a kingdom and without a homeland. Similarly, our Hebrew language did not play a vital role in our perpetuation, for even in biblical times, Aramaic supplanted the Holy Tongue as a spoken language to the extent that parts of the scripture, almost all of our Babylonian Talmud, the Zohar, and other key works were composed in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. Later in the times of Rav Sadia Gaon Maimonides, most of the Jewish masses spoke Arabic. And further down the line, it was Yiddish and other languages. It is so therefore, what kept us as a nation? Was it as our language? Was it our land? No. It is also impossible to ascribe any common secular, cultural, or contemporary scientific knowledge as a major preservation factor for our people, since such matters morphed radically from one era to another. The only remaining consideration, which is the sole factor that has remained consistent throughout the ages in all lands and under the fullest diversity of circumstance, is the Torah and mitzvahs that Jews have observed in their daily life with great self-sacrifice. So the Rebbe is saying that what makes us a nation, not a land, not a language, not a food, not a culture, it's the Torah. So therefore, what do the nations have to say? What do the nations say? You're anyway people in the book. What do you need a land for? This is the answer. The response to this is that the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is unique. It is not comparable to the relationship between any other nation in its homeland, right? Most nations become a nation because they live on a specific land. So the land makes them the nation. We were a nation before we got the land of Israel. Rather, the Jewish land is an integral part of the Jewish people's spiritual mission. The ultimate goal of the Jewish people's divine service is to turn this tangible world into a home for Hashem's revelation, to the point that God's holiness dwells specifically in the physical reality of this world. For this reason, the majority of the Torah's commandments involve physical activities, so that the fulfillment of Torah mitzvahs installs sanctity into the tangible materials. It was therefore critical that Hashem provide the Jews with the land of Israel, a physical land, and to provide them with an abundance of mitzvahs that can be performed exclusively in this land. But this expresses the entire goal of the Jewish people and the purpose of the Torah, to conquer the physical dimension of the world and transform it into a home for God. Meaning, we are not a people of the land. The land didn't make us a people. What makes us a people is the Torah. But the Torah demands of us that what should we do? What is our mission? To engage the physical. You know what? Hashem gave us a physical part on this planet where we can fulfill our mission. You know, we're the physical part of this planet, which Hashem gave us to fulfill our mission. That's called the land of Israel.
The home of the Jewish people.
Right. And this is something that we have to talk to our youth about. If we don't talk about God, and we don't talk about the history of creation, and we don't talk about the history of the Jewish people, and we build this whole mountain on 1948, we're doomed.
Those people don't even believe God.
Well, we don't teach our children. We don't talk to the children about God.
No, I'm talking about
Forget about the United Nations. Forget about the United Nations. We're talking about here. We're the greatest challenge we have is not the non-Jewish anti-Semites.
I understand.
It's
But
the Jewish
are
anti-Semites.
the
Why?
Semites that
Why?
don't
Why?
believe-
One second. Why? Why are the Jewish anti-Semites the problem? Because they give legitimacy to the non-Jews. That's the
Yeah,
what,
especially Orthodox people, the Jewish Orthodox.
really Jewish Orthodox. They're very. What do the Jewish Orthodox people do?
There's a lot of Jewish Orthodox people. They don't believe that Israel should be existing.
You're talking about. You're talking about the Torah Carta. What are you talking about?
Yeah, as a country.
Okay, you're talking about a fringe. The overwhelming majority of Jewish people believe and know that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people. Let's not talk about the fringe. The problem we have in the United Nations or in universities is not from these few hundred in the Torah cards, I promise you. It's about thousands of secular Jews that unfortunately were not educated as Jews, and they think like Hellenists. Exactly, there's no difference between now and the time of Hanukkah.
How can you change somebody's mind if they don't?
I
believe
know. Listen, we have to start with education. We have to start with the education. That's all. When children grow up with the wrong fundamentals of our connection to the land of Israel, then you're going to end up like this article. This guy is turned off by Theodor Herzl. He's connected to the English colonialists because he grew up. He says clearly he grew up with not a discussion about God, discussion about Israel's connection to us is because Theodor Herzl and the United Nations created the state of Israel. If you go down that road, you're doomed. You have to tell the truth and not be ashamed of the truth. We have to tell our children the truth. Whenever we try, here's the point. It's not just about Israel. Whenever you try to water down Judaism and not say the truth about what it is, thinking you'll save the rest of Judaism, like what the hell is this thing? They say, we'll save the rest of the Judaism by assimilating for the things that what the Greeks don't like about us. So what do we have to deal with? The Greeks are the new mode. They're the cool people. And we want to be part of the cool people. They're not looking to get rid of the whole Torah. They just don't like some of the antiquated things we're doing. Bris, Shabbos, right? Why are we fighting them? They're right. That's you. Whenever Jews go down that road, we're doomed. I'm going to tell you now, before we conclude, just want to tell you a little story that happened in the 40s. The previous Rebbe came on one of the last ships that escaped war-torn Europe to the United States in 1940. And from 1940 to 1950, he worked to build Jewish day schools and so on. And he always talked about authentic Judaism. His first statement when he came off the boat was 4 words. America is nicht anders. America is no different. We can transplant authentic Judaism of the shtetl here in America. And guess what? Most people laughed at him and thought he's not practical. And at one of the, let's call it communal meetings of communal leaders of which he attended, and all types of persuasions were there. And they were talking about how to educate the youth. How are we going to fight assimilation? Talking in the 40s, 70 years ago. One rabbi got up, or community leader got up, and said to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, he said, Rebbe, I have a question for you. If there's a fire burning, don't you grab any pail of water to put out the fire? Whether the pail is clean water or dirty water, you just got to put out the fire. We have a fire of assimilation going on, and you're getting caught up. Is it 100% authentic, or is it not 100% authentic? Okay, so it's dirty water. But we're trying to put out a fire of assimilation. You know what the Rebbe said to him? The Rebbe said to him, what happens if you can't, when you put out a fire, you can't just take any liquid. What happens if you pick up a pail of kerosene and you put that on the fire? Are you putting out the fire with liquid, or are you making it worse? So the previous Rebbe, not giving our youth the truth, not muddied water, it's kerosene, it's not going to help. This was a debate in the 40s. whether if we water down Judaism, will that stem assimilation, or will it contribute to assimilation? That was a debate 70 years ago. Now we see, you move forward 70 years, you see in those movements where they try to water down Judaism and make it palatable to the society around us, those movements are just going down, down, down. You see clearly that they picked up a pail of kerosene. They haven't helped. They haven't helped stem assimilation. Assimilation is much worse now than it was 50, 60, 70 years ago. Because the pail they picked up is not dirty water, it's kerosene. The same thing is in this situation. We have to, what preserved Jews and Judaism is emes. You know what emes is? It has to be true. True has to be in all times and all places. If we tell our children, that certain mitzvahs were good for our great-grandparents, we are modern people, we are enlightened people, they're not for us. You know what? So we put the bar here. You know what? You know what the message that the kids get is not authentic. Because if it's true, it should be true in all times and all places. Well, if it's not authentic, why do I want it at all? It's not just the problem that if I put the bar here, the next generation will put the bar a little lower, a little lower. That's in general a problem. We're facing a much bigger problem. The bigger problem is it's all Baba Mises. If I didn't grow up in a traditional home, in a real authentic Jewish home, I would, if I grew up without mentioning names, in other persuasions, I would say, listen, this is all Baba Mises. You telling me it changes? So now a committee of rabbis vote, this is permitted. 10 years later, who's decided, is this real or not? Is it real because some people are getting up and making a vote? What's going on? I would say the whole thing, I should give up the girl I want or the temptation that I want because a community of rabbis got together and voted. What are you talking about? Is it real or not? If it's real, then it's real. And if it's not real, what are you telling me? This is acceptable, but this is not acceptable. I'll decide what's acceptable. And this is the same thing, the same attitude that happened in the Hellenists, the same thing attitude that happened with Torah observance, the same thing is happening now with Israel. We're not saying the truth. We based our whole education of our children that the state of Israel was founded in 1948. It sounds good and it's all good. We can dance Hava Nagila. But what's going to happen when these children face real questions which can dispute it, which can literally dispute it? So then, you know what? Then not only do we don't have children that are not pro-Israel, we now got so bad that we have children that are actually demonstrating against Israel. In the latest Hamas, in the latest Hamas attacks, there were Jews that were identifying with Hamas. You ever heard of such a thing? Imagine Jews identifying with Nazis. Jews identifying with Hamas. You understand? Palestinian flags, pro-Palestinian against Israel, Jewish kids in this community. Not normal. How did it happen?
It's religious Jews doing the same thing.
The religious Jews that do the same thing I promise you, there's no threat. They're not with J Street. They're not. There's no threat. Believe me. You're talking. Listen, they're also misguided. They're also misguided. I'm not talking about religious, not religious. I'm talking about if it's authentic or not authentic. Sure, they're misguided. There's misguided. Listen, the Yetzer Hara and the Satan. They're 100%. Okay. You know, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who was a great rabbi, a great author and poet, lived in Spain. He said, "Ani v'mayra v'libi v'mizrach." I am in the west, my heart is in the east, referring to the land of Israel. Jews throughout the ages, no matter where they were, they knew their place was Israel. Most of our Amidah, 3 times a day we do the Amidah, most of the Amidah is talking about our connection to the land of Israel, our hope. Not because it was created in 1948. The Amidah was created much before 1948. It's because that is the eternal connection. That's what we have to talk about. We have to talk about the emes, the truth. We'll wrap it up right now because it's getting late. I'm going to share the key points of today's class. Please join me here. And I hope I'm doing it right. Give me a second. Lesson 3.
Lesson 3, The Promised Land. 1. Anti-Semitism seeks legitimacy from the most prestigious authority of any given era. At present, this authority is the pursuit of human rights. Consequently, many of today's anti-Semites focus overwhelmingly on Israel and accuse it of being the ultimate violator of human rights. 2. When Israel is A. demonized, or B. judged with a double standard, or C. when Israel's existence is delegitimized, that challenge exposes itself as an expression of anti-Semitism. 3. When anti-Semites refrain from asserting that they seek to annihilate Jewry, but merely take issue with specific Jewish beliefs or practices, claiming them to be barbaric, Jews can be tempted to join the fight against their fellow Jews, believing that they are saving Jews rather than hurting them. 4. There are several arguments for why Jews need and have a right to Israel. Most crucial is the Torah's oft-reiterated reminder that God gave Jews the land of Israel as an eternal inheritance. The deeper our appreciation of this reality, and the more we educate the next generation about its implications, the more support we will nourish toward the land of Israel. Such an approach can desirably influence the wider audience, but the most vital audience is our Jewish brothers and sisters. 5. To support Torah and God-based reasoning, it is necessary to create an environment that cherishes the Torah and nurtures faith. It is therefore critical to provide a robust Jewish education to ourselves and to the next generation. 6. Jews are a nation not because of our land, but because of our Torah. Nevertheless, the land is important to the Torah's vision for the world inasmuch as it embodies the Jewish mission on earth, to infuse physicality with holiness.
Okay. Where is it? No, it's very upsetting. The goal of the topic, the goal is not to be upset. The goal of this class is what to do, right? That's what we had in the first class, not to fear. We have to say, what is my mission now? Our mission now is not to wait till the kids get to college. We had a speaker over here who speaks in colleges. Someone asked him, what do we do about the kids in college? He says, by the time they get to college, it's too late. You got to get the kids now. The most wasted time of a Jewish child in today's current environment in America is, you know when? From bar mitzvah to college. They get almost no education, and they start thinking independently. So we're sending to our colleges kids that are trying to think independently, but they're not given the food. Most kids you talk to them, they have no concept. They're not. How can they be ambassadors for the Jewish people if they don't know what they represent? So they're busy being like everyone else instead of being proud of who they are. They're not proud of who they are. Why? Because the parents are unfortunately not acting the way that they're proud of who they are. So it all starts with education. We have to educate the next generation so that we're sending ambassadors to our colleges and not apologists to our colleges. And that's really the situation we're facing. The biggest threat now in America to the state of Israel or to anti-Semitism are Jews that are aligned with these anti-Israel groups.
Israel for a long time didn't defend itself.
Listen. Forget. There's enough blame to get it wrong, right? Israel didn't explain itself, whatever. But you know what? There are many Israeli kids that are going to fight. They're giving up their life. They also have to know what they're fighting for. Israel, thank God, now, I don't know how long it is now. Israel, every group that gets initiated in the army, they go to the Kotel, they go to Jewish historical sites. They don't just take the kids to Tel Aviv and talk about Ben Gurion and Theodor Herzl. You got to give the kids roots. Roots are not 70 years. Roots are thousands of years. Now, I have a picture of,
They have to go to Israel.
there you go. That's why Birthright is doing a very good job, taking kids to Israel. But the education the kids get in Birthright is very important. Not all Birthright groups are the same, but the point is, even in Israel themselves, you have Israelis that are growing up with a lack of roots. Lack of roots, and that's why, you know how many Israelis there are that, you know, when they find their Judaism, when they come here? They come here. I remember many years ago, I was in Australia, and I went to, in Chabad, during the summer months, you go to outlying communities. I went to Brisbane. I was 19 years old. I was a kid. I'm a kid now, my wife says. But so I Friday night, I meet in shul 3 Israeli backpackers. You know what they told me? You would never, ever see us in shul on a Friday night in Israel. Never. Never. Maybe Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Maybe. You know why? Because they weren't taught about the personal shul. You know what? When they come outside of Israel, all of a sudden they feel they're missing something. You understand? So they found a shul in Brisbane, Australia. Now they're identifying as Jews. Thank God that they have. The point is, we have to educate proud Jews, and proud Jews are educated. They know our history. They know what the emes is. We only survive with truth. Truth is what kept us alive and thriving, not just alive. That's all. The same thing is over here. If we want Jewish kids to be proud about Israel, can't base Israel in 1948 in the UN and Theodore Herzl and so on. They didn't create the state of Israel. They might have helped us liberate the state of Israel. Can you understand? The beginning of this video was very proud. I never thought about it. The outside of the UN has the saying of Isaiah, that the dream is that God will turn swords into plowshares. This Isaiah would have been considered a settler, you understand? Because he spoke from the Temple Mount, right? The Temple Mount, that's not Jewish heritage, you understand? You understand what kind of crazy world we are? How did the world even get to such a thing? It's because Jews are not saying the truth. We are not educated enough. If we're not educated enough, then how can we explain to the non-Jew, you see this Western Wall, this is our home. It's always been our home from the beginning. We're not talking like that. We talk about Israel as 1948. So okay, so 1948, there was a partition. So okay, the Arabs didn't accept it, but now they want it. So come on, you guys go here, you guys go here. Let's be nice. You understand? We're not saying the truth. So we got to a situation where the United Nations can tell us that because this wall and the Temple Mount is in East Jerusalem, so for 19 years it was under Jordan, guess what? It's not Israel problem. Who would ever think in a million years that any non-Jew would even say such a thing? We brought it about ourselves because we're not educated ourselves. We brought such a crazy situation. A crazy situation, something that's so obvious is even being debated is crazy. So it's all about the Jewish education, and the anti-Semites always fought Jewish education. The Hellenists fought Jewish education, and the Bolsheviks fought Jewish education because they knew if they get the minds of our children, they removed any resistance. That's all. We need proud Jewish kids. Okay, it was a great introduction to Hanukkah. It's coming up in 10 days, literally 10 days from tomorrow. We're going to be lighting the menorah. So have a good Hanukkah. Don't forget to buy your candles and your menorahs. Get everything ready to celebrate Jewish pride. Be well. Okay. Be well, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Sei gesinnt.
Good night, Rabbi.
Good night, good night. Stop this. Do you know how to stop this? Where do you stop it? Be well, good night. How do I?
counter to living challenge is there are 11 people in this community in this class. How do we reach out to more? The thousands more?
That's a good.
That's the reaching.
If the 11 will have an effect, and another 11.